I arrived too soon and noticed a car outside. Inside, he leaned close and whispered, "You're perfect." The house had learned silence the hard way. It carried it in the walls, in the polished surfaces that reflected light without warmth, in the way sound seemed to hesitate before traveling from one room to another. Once, laughter had moved freely through these spaces, bumping into furniture, climbing the staircase, spilling into the kitchen. Now, even the air seemed cautious. I sat at the dining table with my back straight and my hands folded in my lap, as if posture alone could remind my body of authority it no longer possessed. My right arm lay useless, imprisoned in a thick plaster cast that smelled faintly of chalk and antiseptic. The weight of it pulled at my shoulder, a constant reminder that my body had betrayed me, or rather, had been betrayed on my behalf. The table was set with care. Fine china, polished silverware, crystal glasses catching the warm light of the chandelier. Everything about the setting suggested celebration, hospitality, family unity. Everything except my plate.It was empty.Bone-white porcelain, trimmed with a delicate ring of gold, spotless and bare. No bread. No vegetables. No polite token to suggest oversight. Its emptiness was intentional, a quiet cruelty executed with precision. The kind of cruelty that doesn't raise voices or leave visible marks, but still announces power. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. The smell of roasted duck filled the room, rich and heavy, layered with apples, herbs, and rendered fat. It was the smell of effort, of a meal meant to impress. My stomach tightened in response, a reflex I could not stop. Hunger is not polite. It does not care about dignity or pride. It simply announces itself, again and again. Across the table, Marcus sat in my late husband's chair. He had claimed it casually, as if the absence of its rightful owner made it available by default. The chair was high-backed, upholstered in dark velvet worn smooth by decades of use. My husband had favored it, insisting it supported his back better. Seeing Marcus in it felt like an invasion that went beyond furniture. Marcus ate with enthusiasm bordering on aggression. He cut thick slices of duck and shoveled them into his mouth, chewing loudly, drinking often. Grease shone on his lips and chin. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and laughed at his own jokes before anyone else had a chance to react. My daughter, Sierra, sat to his left. She kept her eyes lowered, focusing on slicing cucumbers into thin, identical pieces. Her movements were careful, almost obsessive, as if precision might protect her from the atmosphere thickening around the table. She wore a pale dress that washed the color from her face, making her look tired, older than her years. 3 guests sat around the table, colleagues of Marcus from the city department. People who depended on him. People who understood hierarchy. They ate quietly, glancing at Marcus before speaking, before laughing, before reaching for anything more than what lay directly in front of them. They all noticed my empty plate. No one said a word. My cast rested heavily against my side. Beneath it, my forearm pulsed with a deep, rhythmic ache. I knew the fracture before I ever saw an X-ray. I had heard it, the unmistakable sound of bone giving way under force. A dry, final crunch that echoed louder in memory than it ever had in reality. I flexed the fingers of my left hand slowly. They obeyed. That small mercy felt significant. But the serving platter sat just beyond reach, perfectly placed where my good hand could not lift it without standing, and my injured arm could not assist. The distance was calculated. It always was. "Well, don't be shy," Marcus said loudly, lifting his glass. "Eat up." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. The guests chuckled politely. Sierra's knife paused mid-slice, then resumed. Marcus poured himself another drink, the bottle clinking against the crystal. "This duck is incredible," he continued. "My wife really outdid herself. Didn't you, sweetheart?" Sierra nodded faintly, eyes still down. "I tried," she murmured. I watched her, searching my memory for the moment I lost my daughter. For the moment when love had turned into compliance, when protection had transformed into silence. I had spent decades studying the human brain, mapping damage, predicting outcomes. But I could not pinpoint when this particular loss had occurred. One of the guests, a young man with glasses, cleared his throat. Shouldn't we, maybe serve Dr. Ash? Stay out of it, Marcus cut in sharply, not even glancing his way. The young man recoiled instantly, lowering his gaze and returning to his plate. The lesson was reinforced. Authority had spoken. Marcus leaned back in the chair that did not belong to him and finally looked at me. His eyes were glassy with alcohol, but there was nothing unfocused about his expression. He was enjoying this. Fasting is good for you, he said. Clears the mind. Right, Mama. The word landed wrong. It was not affectionate. It was ownership disguised as familiarity. My daughter says it was an accident, I said calmly. Sierra lifted her head just enough to meet my eyes. Fear flickered there, not fear for me, but fear of the man beside her. It was, she said softly. But you need to be more careful. You don't listen anymore. Marcus laughed. Age does that, he said. Coordination goes. Judgment too. She was climbing up to the top shelf like she's still 30. The guests smiled thinly. She could have broken her neck, Marcus continued. I told her, what are you doing, old woman? But she never listens. My stomach cramped sharply. Hunger. Pain. Rage held in check. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. It belonged to my father. German-made. Always precise. The second hand moved steadily, indifferent to human cruelty. Marcus raised his glass again. To discipline, he announced. A house needs order. Someone has to be in charge. I felt something cold and clear settle inside me. The same feeling I used to summon before stepping into an operating room. When emotion becomes noise, and precision becomes survival, I straightened slightly and spoke his name. Marcus. The room stilled. What? He snapped. You're sitting in my husband's chair, I said. And by my calculation, you have 1 minute left in it. He stared at me, then burst into laughter. What are you going to do? Hit me with your cast. He began counting aloud, mocking me. 59. 58. I didn't respond. I watched the clock. The second hand reached the top. The doorbell rang. Not a polite chime. A long, insistent sound that vibrated through the house like a command. Marcus grinned, triumphant. Right on time, he said, standing. That'll be the lawyer. He walked toward the door, confidence restored. I remained seated, hands steady, eyes on the clock. Because I knew something Marcus didn't. Marcus's footsteps echoed down the hallway with the careless confidence of a man who had never learned to doubt his own authority. His shoes struck the hardwood floor in heavy, uneven beats, and with each step he seemed to swell larger in his own mind, already tasting victory. Paperwork. Signatures. Ownership. He believed the evening was about to end the way all evenings ended for him, with submission. The door lock clicked. A familiar sound. Too familiar. Come in, Marcus said loudly, his voice coated in false warmth. We've been waiting. I trust you brought everything. We've got a little delay with. His sentence broke apart in midair. Not faded. Not trailed off, snapped. The silence that followed was unnatural, dense, as if the hallway itself had drawn in a breath and refused to release. The table. Forks froze halfway to their mouths. Crystal glasses hovered. Forgotten. Sierra's hand tightened around her wine glass so hard her knuckles blanched. No one spoke. No one moved. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the shuffling pace of an attorney, not the polite hesitation of a man unsure whether he was welcome. These were measured, deliberate steps, heavy enough to register authority before the owner ever came into view. Each footfall landed with certainty, as if the floor itself existed to support that weight. Marcus's voice returned, but it was no longer booming. It had thinned, stretched tight with panic. Governor. Governor Hale. The name rippled through the dining room like an electric shock. One of the guests gasped. Another dropped a piece of duck onto the tablecloth, grease blooming outward like a stain that would never fully come out. Sierra's eyes widened. her lips parting as if she might scream or pray or both. Two men appeared in the doorway first. They were large, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark suits that did nothing to hide their military bearing. They scanned the room without expression, eyes sharp, movements minimal. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. Then the governor stepped inside. Time did not stop, but it slowed enough for the mind to register detail. Gray hair at the temples. Deep lines carved around eyes that had seen too much and learned how to carry it. A tailored suit that fit a body once trained for war. And in his hands, of all things, a small bouquet of blue wildflowers, vibrant against the muted tones of his clothes. Marcus rushed forward, bowing slightly, his earlier swagger collapsing into frantic deference. "Governor Hale, what an honor. If I'd known, you should have told us. You should have." The governor did not look at him, he did not acknowledge the extended hand. He did not slow his stride. Marcus stood frozen, arms still outstretched, humiliation creeping up his neck like a rash. The governor's gaze locked onto me. He crossed the dining room without haste, passing the table laden with food, the guests shrinking into their chairs as he moved by. His eyes flicked briefly to the spread, roasted duck, salads, glasses half filled with alcohol, then settled on my plate. Empty. Then his eyes moved to my arm. The cast. I watched his jaw tighten. It was a small movement, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that comes not from temper, but from restraint. He stopped beside my chair. Without ceremony, without concern for his expensive suit, he lowered himself to one knee on the hardwood floor beside me. The room ceased to exist. The governor of the state, whose portrait hung in municipal buildings, whose signature decided budgets and careers, knelt beside an old woman with a broken arm and an empty plate. He placed the bouquet gently on the table near my untouched china, the blue petals, stark against white porcelain. Then he covered my left hand with his, warm and steady, careful not to squeeze. "You told me you fell," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "But you didn't tell me," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "that you were being starved." The words did not need to be loud. They struck with surgical precision. Marcus swallowed audibly behind him. The guests sat motionless, their earlier discomfort replaced by outright terror. They understood something irreversible was unfolding. This was no longer a family dinner. This was an inquest. The governor rose slowly to his feet. He did not rush. Power does not rush. He turned toward the head of the table, toward the chair Marcus had occupied minutes earlier, and placed his hand on the backrest. He waited. Marcus's body responded before his pride could protest. He stumbled backward, nearly colliding with Sierra's chair, then stepped aside as if burned. His face had gone pale, the color of spoiled milk. He did not argue. He did not laugh. The governor Saturday, the chair seemed to accept him, settling without a sound. He adjusted the linen napkin across his lap with deliberate calm, then glanced at the silverware Marcus had left behind, greasy, discarded carelessly on the tablecloth. With a faint look of distaste, he nudged them aside using only his pinky finger point. One of the men in black stepped forward instantly, producing a clean set of utensils and placing them before the governor with silent efficiency. The movement was so smooth it might have been rehearsed 1,000 times, and no one breathed. The governor reached for the serving platter with ease and pulled it closer. He picked up the knife and began to cut. Not tears. Not hack. Cut. His movements were precise, practiced. He separated the meat into small, manageable pieces, the way one does for someone injured, or ill, or deserving of care. Each slice was neat, intentional. Marcus stood behind him, trembling. Sweat beaded along his hairline and rolled down his temple, disappearing into his collar. When the governor finished, he speared a piece of duck with his fork and turned toward me. "Please," he said quietly. "Eat." The room held its breath. I opened my mouth and accepted the food. The taste flooded my senses, rich, savory, warm. My stomach clenched painfully at first, then relaxed as nourishment spread through my body. I chewed slowly, deliberately, refusing to let hunger make me hurried or small. The governor waited. Another bite. Then another. Only when the sharp edge of hunger dulled did he set the fork down. He wiped his hands with the napkin, then spoke into the stillness without turning. "Which one of you," he asked calmly, is responsible for the lesson Dr. Ashworth received? The words landed like a verdict waiting for a name. Marcus let out a nervous laugh, thin and wet. Governor, come on, he said quickly. It's just family nonsense. A misunderstanding. She's confused, you know, he tapped his temple with one finger. The gesture made my stomach turn. She fell, Marcus continued hurriedly. Old bones. Fragile. Slipped on the stairs. We wanted to call an ambulance, but she refused. We take excellent care of her. Silence followed. I swallowed and spoke. There are no stairs in this condo, I said clearly. We live on one level. The thresholds were removed years ago. The lie collapsed instantly. Marcus froze, his mouth still open. The guests stared at him in horror. Sierra's glass slipped from her fingers and hit the table with a sharp clink. The governor slowly raised his eyes to Marcus. No stairs, he repeated softly. Marcus stammered, scrambling for another explanation, but the words tangled and died in his throat. The governor turned his attention to me again. May I? He asked gently. I nodded toward my medical bag. Inside, I said. There's proof. The governor retrieved the X-ray film and lifted it toward the chandelier. Light flooded through it, illuminating the jagged fracture line. He studied it briefly, then lowered it. This, he said evenly, is not a fall. He stepped closer to Marcus, who pressed himself against the china cabinet, dishes rattling behind him. This is a defensive fracture, the governor continued. The kind that happens when someone raises their arm to protect their head. Marcus slid down the cabinet, knees buckling. The governor turned to his security chief. Call the district attorney, he said. I want a full audit. Immediately. Marcus whimpered. 5 minutes ago, the governor added quietly. The words echoed like a gunshot. The room did not erupt. It did not explode into shouting or chaos the way Marcus's temper always did. Instead, it collapsed inward, folding under the weight of what had just been said. The words full audit carried a gravity that even the guests understood, even if they didn't know the full reach of Marcus's corruption. An audit was not a warning. It was an autopsy performed on a living body. Marcus's knees finally gave out. He slid down the china cabinet until he sat on the floor, legs splayed awkwardly, one hand clawing at the polished wood as if it might anchor him to something solid. His breathing came in ragged bursts, each inhale a fight, each exhale a whimper. No, he whispered. No, no, no. The guests looked at one another, eyes wide, faces drained of color. They had come to this dinner thinking they were attending a demonstration of power. They were now witnesses to its removal. No one dared to stand. No one dared to speak. They had learned, too late, that association leaves fingerprints. Sierra rose abruptly from her chair, the movement sharp and panicked. This is ridiculous, she cried, her voice cracking. You don't understand. My mother exaggerates. She's confused. She's been confused for a while now. I turned my head slowly to look at her. For a moment, I saw my daughter as she truly was in that instant. Not a victim, not a frightened spouse, but a woman scrambling to preserve a structure that had benefited her. Her fear was not for me. It was for herself. The governor did not look at her yet. He let her speak. He let the lie form fully, because lies are most fragile when allowed to stand on their own. She's becoming aggressive, Sierra continued desperately. She throws things. She screams. Last night she attacked Marcus. He was just trying to restrain her. She could have hurt herself. Marcus lifted his head, seizing the opening. Yes, he croaked. Exactly. We were protecting her. I felt no urge to interrupt. Truth does not hurry. Sierra, I said calmly. She flinched at the sound of my voice. You saw me on the floor, I continued. You saw my arm bent the wrong way. You heard the bone break. Her eyes flickered. Fear. Recognition. Calculation. You did not call for help, I said. You did not bring ice. You did not ask if I could feel my fingers. Her lips trembled. You leaned down, I said, my voice steady, and told me to be quiet because the neighbors might hear. A sob tore out of her, sharp and involuntary. The governor finally turned toward her. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply looked. The silence was unbearable. "Enough," he said, point one word. Final, he turned to his security chief. "Take him." Marcus reacted instantly, animal panic surging through him. He lunged forward, not toward the governor, but toward me, his face twisted with desperation and fury. "This is your fault," he screamed. "You old." He never reached me. The security officers moved as one, intercepting him with practiced efficiency. Strong hands grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. Marcus shrieked, a high broken sound, as his joints were locked and his body forced upright. "No, no, please," he begged. "Governor, we can make a deal. I know things. I can help you." The governor turned away from him, already finished. "Remove him," he said. Marcus was dragged toward the door, his shoes scraping uselessly against the floor, his voice bouncing off the walls as he pleaded, threatened, and finally sobbed. He called Sierra's name. He called mine. He promised obedience. He promised silence. The front door opened. Cold night air rushed in. Then the door closed again with a heavy final sound. The house exhaled. Sierra collapsed into a chair, her body folding in on itself. Her sobbing filled the space Marcus had vacated, raw and uncontrolled. The guests sat frozen, afraid to draw attention to themselves, afraid to move without permission. The governor turned back to the table. He looked at the empty seat across from me. Then to the guests. "You are dismissed," he said evenly. They did not hesitate. Chairs scraped softly. Apologies were murmured that meant nothing. One by one, they filed out, heads bowed, eyes averted. Careers were being recalculated in real time. When the door finally closed behind the last of them, only 3 of us remained. The governor, my daughter, and me. The chandelier hummed faintly above us. The grandfather clock ticked on. Sierra lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were red, swollen, stripped of pretense. "Mama," she whispered. "Please." I did not answer immediately. I reached for the dessert fork with my left hand and felt its cool weight settle into my palm. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar task of control. I speared a piece of chocolate cake and brought it to my mouth. I ate. The room stayed silent. Only then did I look at my daughter. "This house," I said quietly, "is no longer a place where fear eats first." Sierra's breath hitched. "You will leave," I continued. "Not tonight. But soon." Her eyes widened in shock. "You will tell the truth," I said. "Every time you are asked. And you will live with it." I set the fork down. "I will live," I finished, "without you here." The governor watched me, something like pride flickering briefly across his face. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, the house finally belonged to me again. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with the blunt insistence of reality, sliding through the windows in pale bands that revealed every surface exactly as it was. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light above the dining table, settling where chaos had ruled only hours earlier. The house looked unchanged, and yet it felt unfamiliar, like a body after surgery. Stitched, stabilized, but still tender. I woke before my alarm, the way I always had during my years at the hospital. The habit was ingrained too deeply to break. My right arm throbbed beneath the cast, the pain no longer sharp but deep and constant, a reminder that healing was work, not magic. I lay still for a moment, listening to my own breathing, cataloging sensations the way I used to before long operations. Pain. Tolerable. Dizziness. None. Fear. Absent. That absence startled me. For years, fear had been the first thing I noticed in the mornings. Fear of confrontation. Fear of making the wrong sound, the wrong movement. Fear of provoking a temper that could erupt without warning. Now there was only quiet, and beneath it, something steadier. I sat up carefully and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cool under my feet. Ordinary. Safe. The hallway greeted me without tension. No raised voices. No locked doors. No sense of waiting for impact. The front door stood closed and solid, not a barrier but a boundary. I paused there for a moment, placing my left hand against the wood, grounding myself in its presence. In the living room, Sierra lay asleep on the couch, curled into herself, her face swollen from crying. She looked smaller like this, stripped of the armor she wore when Marcus was near. For a fleeting moment, the old reflex surged. Cover her with a blanket, stroke her hair, whisper reassurance. I let the moment pass. Compassion without boundaries had nearly destroyed me. I would not make that mistake again. I moved into the kitchen. The smell of last night's meal lingered faintly, but it no longer carried power. I opened the refrigerator and took inventory, not because I needed to, but because it reminded me of something essential. Abundance was not the same as permission. The shelves were full. They always had been. Hunger, I now understood with painful clarity, had been manufactured. I cracked eggs one-handed into a bowl, steady and deliberate. The shell resisted slightly, then gave way. The small victory mattered more than it should have. I whisked slowly, feeling the muscles in my forearm engage, learning a new choreography. When the eggs hit the pan and began to set, the sound was reassuring, a quiet sizzle that belonged to life continuing. I ate standing at the counter, not because I was in a hurry, but because I could. The eggs were simple, imperfectly cooked, but they were mine. I chewed slowly, savoring not the taste but the act itself. Feeding myself felt like reclaiming territory. Behind me, fabric shifted. Sierra stood in the doorway, her eyes rimmed red, her hair tangled. She looked at the plate in my hand, then at my cast, then at the floor. I fell asleep, she said, unnecessarily. Yes, I replied. You did. Silence stretched between us, thick with things unsaid. Is he, she began, then stopped. He will not be returning, I said. Her shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and terror. What happens now? She asked. I turned to face her fully. Now, I said. We stop pretending. She flinched, as if the words were a physical blow. I told them what happened, she said quickly. I told them the truth. You told the truth, I corrected. That is not the same thing. Her jaw tightened. What do you want from me? I finished my bite before answering. Waiting was important. You will leave, I said. Her eyes widened. Today. Yes. Panic surged through her features. I don't have anywhere to go. You have options, I said. You have simply never been forced to use them. She shook her head, tears gathering again. You're throwing me out. No, I said evenly. I am asking you to stop living in a house where you chose silence over decency. Her voice sharpened. I'm your daughter. And I am your mother, I replied. Which means I will not teach you that betrayal has no cost. The words landed hard. She stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Knock came at the door, firm and controlled. Sierra startled violently. I opened it to find one of the governor's aides, composed and professional. He explained the next steps. Medical appointments, protective orders, statements. He spoke with clarity, not pity. I appreciated that. When the door closed, I turned back to Sierra. Pack, I said. She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the bedroom, her movements stiff and angry. Drawers opened. A suitcase thudded onto the bed. The sounds of departure echoed down the hallway. I returned to the counter and washed my plate, one-handed. The warm water soothed my fingers. The act grounded me. When Sierra emerged, suitcase in hand, she looked exhausted and brittle. You'll regret this, she said, not with conviction, but with hurt. Perhaps, I replied. But I would regret it more if I stayed silent. She hesitated at the door, waiting, perhaps for a final reprieve. None came. The door closed behind her with a soft click. I stood alone in the quiet house and felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Relief. Not joy. Not triumph. Relief. The door remained closed after Sierra left, and for several seconds I did not move. I listened to the silence as if it were a new language I needed to learn. It was not the silence of tension, Not the silence of someone holding their breath before an explosion. It was the silence that followed a decision that can no longer be undone. The kind that settles, heavy but honest. I walked through the living room slowly, noticing details that had blurred into the background during the years of unease. The framed photographs along the wall, vacations, birthdays, moments I barely remembered posing for, seemed to watch me with quiet curiosity, as if asking whether I would finally look at them properly. I stopped in front of one taken many years ago, my husband standing beside me, his arm draped around my shoulders. We were both smiling, unaware of the future fractures waiting for us. I touched the glass lightly with my fingertips, then moved on. The phone rang. The sound made my shoulders tense automatically, a reflex born of too many calls that carried demands or accusations. When I answered, the voice on the other end was calm and professional. The orthopedic clinic confirmed my appointment. Another call followed from the district attorney's office, outlining the process ahead. Dates, times, documents. A structure began to form around the chaos, and I welcomed it. The structure was familiar. Structure meant forward motion. Why late morning? The condo felt less like a battleground and more like a workspace awaiting renovation. I opened windows wider, letting fresh air push out the last lingering odors of alcohol and heavy food. I gathered table linens and placed them in the laundry, watching stains dissolve under running water. Each small task felt purposeful. Each task reclaimed a corner of the house from memory. When I reached the dining room again, I stood at the head of the table for a long moment before sitting down. The chair no longer felt like a symbol. It felt like furniture. I placed my left hand on the tabletop and closed my eyes briefly, grounding myself in the solidity of wood beneath my palm. The knock at the door came again, this time lighter. The nurse introduced herself softly, careful but not patronizing. She checked my cast, asked about pain, noted swelling. I answered clearly, clinically. She adjusted the padding and gave instructions. When she finished, she looked at me with a faint smile. "You're doing well," she said. "I intend to continue," I replied. After she left, I sat with a cup of tea and allowed myself, for the first time, to feel tired. Not the exhaustion of fear, but the fatigue that follows resolution. It settled into my bones gently, without panic. I rested without guilt. In the afternoon, a call came from the governor himself. His voice was steady, respectful. "I wanted to check on you," he said, "and to tell you that proceedings are moving forward." I thanked him. We spoke briefly, efficiently. No dramatics. When the call ended, I felt a sense of closure beginning to form. Not because everything was finished, but because it was finally underway. As evening approached, the house darkened naturally, shadows lengthening across the floor. I turned on lamps one by one, creating islands of warm light. The ritual felt almost ceremonial. I cooked again, slower this time, experimenting with movements, learning my limits. The food tasted better than it had any right to, perhaps because I ate without watching the door. When I finished, I washed dishes and dried them carefully, placing each item back where it belonged. Order restored piece by piece, I went to bed early. The sheets felt cool and clean against my skin. I lay on my back, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breath, and for the first time in years, sleep came without resistance. Outside, the city continued its restless motion. Inside, my house finally rested with me. The first official letter arrived 2 days later, slid through the mail slot with a soft scrape that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet house. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the envelope where it rested on the floor, its government seal stark and unmistakable. Once, letters like this had been abstractions, things that happened to other people, cases I read about in passing. Now they were addressed to me. I picked it up with my left hand and carried it to the dining table. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I sat down, adjusted the chair, and took a steadying breath. Old habits resurfaced easily. Preparation mattered. Timing mattered. Panic never helped. The letter outlined procedures in careful language. Protective orders issued, preliminary findings, upcoming interviews. It was written without emotion, but beneath the formal tone ran a current of consequence. Marcus's world was shrinking rapidly, compressed by laws he had long believed applied only to others. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside my teacup. My arm ached, a slow, insistent reminder that injury did not disappear simply because justice had begun. Healing was not linear. I welcomed the honesty of that pain. It kept me present. Another envelope followed later that afternoon, this one from the hospital board. I recognized the letterhead instantly. My husband's name appeared in the header, printed with dignified restraint. Reading it brought a quiet ache, the kind that no longer cut but still lingered. They acknowledged the deed, confirmed my lifetime residency, and offered support, legal, medical, personal, without obligation. The tone was respectful, not pitiful. It mattered more than I expected. I called them back. The woman on the line spoke carefully, as if afraid to overwhelm me. I reassured her. I explained what had happened in clear, factual terms. She listened without interruption, then thanked me, not for the story, but for my courage. I ended the call feeling oddly lighter. My husband's legacy had not been twisted into a bargaining chip. It remained intact, protected. That evening, I sat alone in the living room and allowed myself to remember the night of the injury without flinching. The hallway. The shove. The sound. The way the world narrowed to sensation. I replayed it not to punish myself, but to reclaim it. Trauma loses power when it is named and placed in sequence, no longer allowed to float amorphously in the mind. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by dreams that blended past and present. Operating rooms merged with hallways. Voices overlapped. I woke before dawn with my heart racing, then forced myself to breathe slowly until the room resolved into reality. This bed. This house. This moment. Safe.by morning, resolve replaced exhaustion. The interview with the investigator took place at my dining table. He arrived alone, notebook in hand, demeanor professional and neutral. I appreciated that he did not show sympathy. He asked questions chronologically, allowing me to answer fully before moving on. I spoke steadily, clarifying details, correcting assumptions where necessary. Years of medical testimony had trained me well. When he asked about Sierra, I paused only briefly. She witnessed the injury, I said. She chose not to intervene. He nodded and wrote that down without comment. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. When it ended, I felt drained but grounded. Telling the truth thoroughly is exhausting work, but it creates a kind of internal order that silence never does. Later that day, I ventured outside for the first time since the night Marcus had been taken away. The air felt sharper, colder than I remembered. The building lobby smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. I nodded to the doorman, who looked at me with a new attentiveness, as if something unspoken had shifted. On the sidewalk, the city pressed in around me. Cars, voices, movement. I walked slowly, aware of my balance, aware of my arm, but unafraid. Each step felt deliberate, a statement rather than a risk. At the cafe on the corner, I ordered tea and sat near the window. People passed by without looking at me, wrapped in their own concerns. The anonymity was comforting. I was not a spectacle here. I was simply another woman reclaiming her mourning. When I returned home, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I stared at it for a moment before opening it. It was from Sierra. I don't know where to go, the message read. They're asking questions at work. I didn't think it would happen this fast. I set the phone down without replying. Not because I lacked compassion, but because I understood something Sierra did not yet grasp. Growth begins when rescue does not arrive. She had spent years cushioned by my silence and Marcus's power. Now both were gone. That evening, I cooked again, slower, experimenting, adapting. I burned one dish slightly and laughed out loud when it happened. A small, startled sound that felt foreign and wonderful. The laugh surprised me enough that it brought tears to my eyes. I ate at the table, my plate was full. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt no one watching to see whether I deserved it. The story did not remain contained within the walls of my home for long. By the end of the week, it had begun to leak outward, seeping into places where silence had once protected reputations. It did not arrive as a dramatic headline or a scandal splashed across screens. It came in murmurs first. In careful pauses during meetings. In phones set face down on tables. In the way people suddenly remembered prior appointments when my name surfaced. I learned this not from the news, but from the subtle shift in how the world responded to me. To the orthopedic clinic, the receptionist smiled with a kind of professional warmth that went beyond routine. The doctor examined my arm with clinical precision, confirming what I already knew. The fracture was healing as expected, alignment acceptable, mobility to be regained slowly. He spoke to me as a colleague rather than a patient, acknowledging my understanding, respecting my input. It felt like returning to a language I had not spoken aloud in years. "You'll regain function," he said. "But don't rush it." I nodded. Rushing had never been my problem. Outside the clinic, my phone rang again. This time it was an old colleague from the hospital, someone I had not spoken to in nearly a decade. Her voice was cautious but warm. "I heard," she said. "I imagine you did," I replied. There was a pause. "I'm sorry," she added. "I wish I'd known." "So do I said honestly. That evening, an article appeared online, brief, restrained, but unmistakable. An assistant director in the housing department had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. No names mentioned yet, but the description was clear enough for anyone who knew how to read between lines. Corruption. Abuse of authority. Ongoing inquiry. I read it once, then closed the page. Marcus had always believed his power came from visibility, from being known. In truth, it came from people choosing not to look too closely. Now eyes were opening. The next message from Sierra arrived late that night. "They suspended me," it read. "They say I knew. They say I should have reported it." I stared at the screen for a long moment. I could almost hear her voice, brittle with shock. She had lived under the illusion that proximity to power offered immunity. Now she was learning the difference between protection and complicity. I typed a response, then erased it. Typed again. Erased again. In the end, I sent only one sentence. "Tell the truth. It's the only thing that still belongs to you." No reply came. Days passed. My routine settled into something stable, if unfamiliar. Mornings began with exercises prescribed by the therapist, slow and sometimes frustrating, always precise. I read in the afternoons, books I had meant to return to for years. In the evenings I cooked, experimenting with what my left hand could manage, celebrating small improvements like victories. The house adapted to me, just as I adapted to it. I rearranged shelves, moved frequently used items within reach, removed things that carried too much memory. Each adjustment was an assertion. I live here now on my own terms. One afternoon, the doorbell rang. I froze instinctively, then corrected myself. Fear was no longer the default response. When I opened the door, the governor stood there, alone this time, without his security detail. He looked slightly out of place in the narrow hallway, as if unused to being just a man rather than an institution. "I hope this isn't an intrusion," he said. "No," I replied. "Come in." We sat in the living room, tea between us. He spoke plainly, updating me on the investigation. Charges were being prepared. Evidence was substantial. Marcus's financial records painted a picture far uglier than even he had suspected. "I wanted you to hear it directly," the governor said. "Not through channels." "I appreciate that," I replied. He hesitated, then added, "Your daughter, her situation is complicated." I met his gaze. "So is mine," I said. "But complexity does not excuse harm." He nodded, accepting that boundary without argument. Before he left, he stood and looked around the room, taking in the quiet order. "You've reclaimed this place," he said. "Yes," I answered. "And I intend to keep it." That night, I slept deeply, dreamless for the first time since the injury. Outside, the city continued to move. Inside, my life was no longer paused. The first subpoena arrived on a Tuesday, folded with bureaucratic neatness and delivered with the dull inevitability of gravity. By then, I had grown accustomed to official envelopes, to seals pressed into thick paper, to language designed to sound neutral while carrying the weight of consequence. I opened it calmly, scanning dates and requirements, noting my role not as an accessory to someone else's story, but as its axis. Struck me then how strange that felt. For years, my existence in this house had been framed as supplemental. I was an inconvenience tolerated for sentiment's sake, a relic of an earlier era that could be ignored until something was needed. Now my name anchored proceedings. Now my account defines timelines. The shift was not loud, but it was total. I placed the subpoena beside the others and made a list. Preparation had always been my refuge. Lists made chaos legible. As the legal machinery began to turn, memory followed. It arrived not as a flood, but as a series of small, sharp recollections that surfaced when I least expected them. The way Marcus used to stand in doorways, arms crossed, blocking exits under the guise of casual conversation. The way Sierra's voice changed when she agreed with him, pitched slightly higher, eager to smooth things over. The way I had learned to measure my own footsteps to avoid drawing attention. These were not dramatic revelations. They were confirmations. The therapist explained it gently when I mentioned the sudden clarity. Trauma, she said, often becomes visible only after safety arrives. The mind stops spending all its energy on survival and begins sorting what it endured. Healing, she warned, was not just physical. It was archaeological. I understood that language. Digging always revealed bones. In the afternoons, I walked farther each day. The city became familiar again, not as a place to navigate carefully, but as a space I was allowed to occupy. I noticed the bakery on the corner had changed ownership. I noticed the same elderly man fed pigeons in the park every morning at precisely 9. Life continued without consulting my pain, and there was comfort in that point. One morning, as I returned from the market, I saw Sierra across the street. She stood near a bus stop, shoulders hunched, clutching her phone with both hands. She looked thinner already, as if the protective layer she had lived under had dissolved overnight. When she saw me, she froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she crossed the street. "Mom," she said quietly. I stopped but did not step closer. Distance mattered. "They fired me," she continued, words tumbling out as if afraid of silence. "Not suspended. Fired. They said I failed to report misconduct." "I see," I said, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know it would go this far." "That," I replied, "is the difference between ignorance and willful blindness." She flinched. "They're asking questions," she whispered. "About the money. About the condo. About everything." "Yes," I said. "They will." She looked at me then with something raw and unguarded. "What am I supposed to do?" The question carried no entitlement this time. Only feared. I considered her carefully. This was a moment that could define us both. Rescue would be easy. Silence would be familiar. But neither would be honest. "You are supposed to answer truthfully," I said. "And then you are supposed to live with what follows." Her lips trembled. "You don't love me anymore." The accusation was old. I recognized it immediately. "I love you," I said calmly. "But love is not immunity. And it is not amnesia." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing a language she had never been taught. Then she stepped back, uncertainty written across her face. "I'm staying with a friend," she said. "For now." "That's good," I replied. She hesitated, then turned and walked away. I watched her go without chasing her. Later that week, the governor called again. This time his tone was different, not urgent, but deliberate. "They've uncovered evidence tying Marcus to misuse of municipal storage properties," he said. "Large scale. It's worse than we thought." I closed my eyes briefly. I had suspected as much. Men like Marcus rarely stop at one line crossed. "And?" I asked. "And he's talking," the governor said. "Trying to negotiate." That did not surprise me either. When the court date arrived, I dressed carefully, choosing clothing that made me feel grounded rather than defensive. The cast was gone by then, replaced with a brace, my arms still stiff but improving. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. It felt familiar in an abstract way, another institutional space where truth competed with narrative. Marcus looked smaller at the defense table. Not physically diminished, but stripped. His suit hung poorly, his confidence gone. When his eyes found mine, something like panic flared briefly before he looked away. He did not smile. He did not speak. I testified without embellishment. I described the shove, the injury, the isolation, the threats, the hunger. Each fact landed cleanly. Each one found its place in the record. I did not look at him while I spoke. I did not need to. When I stepped down, my knees trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. Years of silence drained from me in that moment. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. I did not stop. I did not owe them anything. That evening, I returned home and sat at my table. My plate was full. The house was quiet. And for the first time, the past no longer pressed against the present, demanding obedience. The days after the first court appearance unfolded with a strange duality. On the surface, life appeared almost mundane. Groceries still needed buying. Appointments still filled my calendar. The city buses still groaned at intersections, and the neighbors still argued softly through thin walls. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, something fundamental had shifted. The world had begun to reorient itself around the truth instead of around avoidance. I woke early the morning after testifying, not from anxiety, but from habit. My arm ached in a new way, not sharp, not threatening, but insistent, as muscles relearned their purpose. I performed the exercises slowly, counting each repetition the way I once counted sutures, focusing on precision rather than speed. Recovery, like surgery, rewarded patience. While I worked, my mind drifted backward, not to the violence itself, but to the years that had preceded it. I remembered the first time Marcus raised his voice in this house. It had seemed so minor then, so easily dismissed as stress or frustration. I remembered how Sierra had laughed it off, how I had told myself it was none of my business. That memory stung more than I expected. Not because of guilt alone, but because of clarity. Neglect is rarely malicious. It is simply convenient. Late that morning, I received a call from the hospital board again. This time they asked if I would consider returning, not to surgery, but to teaching. Advisory work. Mentorship. My initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a flicker of something I had not felt in years, anticipation. I'm not sure I'm ready, I said honestly. Readiness is overrated, the chair replied gently. Experience isn't. I promised to think about it. That afternoon, I walked to the park and sat on a bench beneath a tree just beginning to shed its leaves. The air smelled faintly of earth and metal. Children played nearby, their laughter sharp and bright. I watched them without envy, without longing. Life had not passed me by. It had simply changed its pace. A woman sat beside me, a stranger, and commented on the weather. We spoke briefly, casually, about nothing of consequence. When she stood to leave, she smiled and wished me a good day. The interaction was unremarkable, and precisely because of that, it felt profound. I was no longer marked by fear. I was simply present. The next message from Sierra arrived that evening. I told them everything, it read. I didn't protect him this time. I read it twice, then set the phone down. No surge of relief followed, no rush of forgiveness. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, like noting a pulse. She had taken a step. It was not my step to take for her. That night, I dreamed of the operating room again, but this time the dream was different. The lights were softer. The tension is absent. I woke with a sense of steadiness rather than dread. As weeks passed, Marcus's case unraveled further. More charges. More names surfaced. The structure he had built to elevate himself collapsed outward, pulling others into the light. Each revelation reinforced something I had long known in theory but only now understood in practice. Systems survive on silence far more than they do on strength. One afternoon, I found myself reorganizing my study. Old textbooks lined the shelves, their margins filled with notes written in my own younger hand. I ran my fingers along the spines, remembering nights spent studying, years spent honing skill and judgment. I had not lost that woman. I had simply set her aside. The phone rang again. This time it was a journalist, asking for a comment. I declined politely. My story was not a commodity. It was a life. Instead, I wrote. Not for publication. Not for validation. I wrote for clarity. I described events as they had happened, without drama, without apology. I wrote about fear, yes, but also about complacency. About how easily dignity can be eroded when resistance feels exhausting. The words came steadily, as if waiting. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf. It did not need an audience. It needed to exist. By the end of the month, the brace on my arm came off. Movement returned slowly, imperfectly, but reliably. I practiced writing with my right hand again, my script shaky at first, then gradually steadier. Each line felt like reclaiming territory. On a quiet evening, as the city lights flickered outside my window, I realized something with sudden clarity. I was no longer waiting for apologies, for outcomes, for permission. I was already living the consequences of my choice. And it was enough. The call from Sierra came just after dusk, at that hour when the city seems to hesitate between day and night. The lights outside my window flickered on in uneven clusters, and somewhere below, a car alarm wailed briefly before being silenced. I watched the phone vibrate on the table for a long moment before answering. Not because I was afraid of what she would say, but because I understood now that timing matters. I wanted to hear her without resentment clouding my attention. "Mom," she said. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, stripped of its old defensiveness. "Can I see you?" There it was. Not a demand. Not an assumption. A request. "Yes," I said. "Tomorrow afternoon." She exhaled audibly, as if she had been holding her breath for days. "Thank you." When the call ended, I remained seated, hands folded, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sounds of neighbors moving through their own lives. I did not feel relieved. I did not feel dread. I felt prepared. The next day, I cleaned the apartment slowly, not because it was necessary, but because order helped me think. I placed fresh flowers in a small vase on the table, not as a gesture of welcome, but as a marker of presence. I was not hiding. I was not bracing. I was simply there. Sierra arrived exactly on time. She stood at the door when I opened it, shoulders tense, hands clasped together as if unsure what to do with them. She looked older than she had a month ago. Consequence ages people quickly. She stepped inside and stopped, as if waiting for instructions. "Sit," I said gently, indicating the chair across from me. She obeyed, perching on the edge, eyes darting briefly around the room. "It looks different," she said. "It is," I replied. She nodded, swallowing. "I've been meeting with lawyers," she began. "They say I might be charged. Not for what he did, but for what I didn't stop." "Yes," I said, her eyes filled, but she did not cry. "I didn't think silence counted as harm." "It always does," I replied. "Especially when you have a voice and choose not to use it." She looked down at her hands. "I was afraid." "I know," I said. "Fear explains behavior. It does not excuse it." She flinched, but she did not argue. We sat in silence for a moment. It was not hostile. It was heavy, but honest. "I'm not asking you to save me," she said finally. "I know I don't deserve that." The words surprised me. Not because they were self-aware, but because they were unpolished. She was no longer negotiating. She was saying, "What are you asking?" I asked. She met my eyes. "I'm asking if you'll still speak to me." "Not forgiven. Just speak." I considered her carefully. This was the question that mattered. Not love. Not blood. Relationship. "I will speak to you," I said slowly. "But not at the cost of my safety, my truth, or my dignity." She nodded, tears finally spilling over. "I understand. I will not lie for you," I continued. "I will not minimize what happened. And I will not pretend that trust can be rebuilt quickly. I wouldn't ask that, she whispered. Good, I said. She stayed for less than an hour. We did not hug. We did not revisit childhood memories. We spoke about practical things: housing, work prospects, therapy. When she left, she thanked me again, not for kindness, but for clarity. After she was gone, I sat alone and allowed myself to feel the ache that followed. It was not a regret. It was grief, for the daughter I thought I had, for the years that could not be reclaimed. Grief does not mean reversal. It means acknowledgement. Weeks later, the verdict came. Marcus accepted a plea deal. Multiple charges. Prison time. Asset seizure. Public disgrace. His name appeared in print at last, stripped of titles, reduced to facts. I read the article once, then folded the paper and placed it in the recycling. He no longer occupied space in my mind. Sierra's outcome followed. Probation. Mandatory counseling. Loss of professional standing. Consequences measured, but real. When she told me, her voice was steady. She did not ask me to intervene. I'm starting over, she said. That is the only kind of start that matters, I replied, and the months that followed, I accepted the hospital board's offer. I returned, not to the operating room, but to a lecture hall filled with young faces and restless ambition. I taught them not only anatomy, but judgment. Not only technique, but responsibility. I told them plainly that brilliance without integrity destroys more than it heals. They listened. Home, the house settled fully into its new rhythm. The clock ticked steadily. Meals were shared with friends, colleagues, sometimes alone. The table no longer held fear. It held conversation, silence chosen rather than imposed. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the city glow, I realized something quietly profound. I had not been rescued. I had operated on my life. On my family. On the rot that threatened to consume me. And like all necessary surgeries, it had been painful, precise, and irreversible. Time did not heal everything, but it clarified what healing actually meant. Months passed, marked not by dramatic milestones but by accumulation. Days stacked carefully atop one another, each carrying small proofs of stability. My arm regained strength slowly. Some movements returned effortlessly, others resisted, reminding me that repair always leaves evidence behind. I accepted that. Bodies, like lives, do not reset. They adapt. Returning to the hospital as an educator reawakened parts of me I had not realized were dormant. The lecture hall smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a familiar blend that stirred muscle memory deeper than thought. Students filled the seats with nervous energy, notebooks open, eyes sharp. They expected expertise. They did not expect honesty. I gave them both. I spoke of anatomy and pathology, of nerves and vessels and the consequences of careless hands. Then I spoke of judgment, of the responsibility that comes with authority, of how power without restraint corrodes from the inside. I did not tell them my story directly. I did not need to. The weight behind my words carried its own gravity. After class, a young woman approached me hesitantly. "Thank you," she said. "No one talks about that part." "They should," I replied. "It's the part that decides whether you become dangerous." At home, the house continues to transform. Not through renovation but through use. Friends visited. Former colleagues brought wine and stories. Laughter returned cautiously at first, then more freely. I noticed how sound now moved through the rooms without resistance, how it lingered rather than recoiled. I also noticed my own reactions. Raised voices no longer sent adrenaline flooding my system. Unexpected knocks no longer froze me in place. The body learns safety the way it once learned fear. Through repetition. One afternoon, I found an old box in the back of a closet, labeled in my husband's handwriting. Inside were letters we had written to each other during long hospital shifts and conferences apart. I sat on the floor and read them slowly, smiling at familiar jokes, aching at the tenderness preserved on paper. He had believed in my strength long before I doubted it. Remembering that felt like reclaiming an inheritance. Sierra and I spoke occasionally. Carefully. She attended therapy consistently. She worked temporary jobs, rebuilding credibility inch by inch. Our conversations were no longer entangled with denial or expectation. They were limited, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable. That was progress. Point. One evening, she asked if she could visit again. Yes, I said. For dinner. The word mattered. She arrived carrying a small bag of groceries, uncertain but determined. We cooked together in measured cooperation, negotiating space, learning new patterns. When we sat down to eat, the table felt neither tense nor sentimental. It felt neutral. That neutrality was a gift. I'm learning who I am without him, she said quietly. So am I replied. We ate without rushing. When she left, she hugged me briefly, carefully, as if respecting an invisible boundary. I returned the hug. Not as absolution, but as acknowledgement. Later that night, alone again, I reflected on how survival had reshaped my understanding of family. Blood creates connection. Choice sustains it. Without choice, relationships rot into obligation. I had lived that lesson long enough. Outside, the city breathed, sirens distant, traffic steady, lights blinking in familiar rhythms. Inside, my home held its ground. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the table, my table, feeling the quiet satisfaction of something earned rather than granted. I was no longer defined by what I endured. I was defined by what I refused to carry forward. Legacy reveals itself not in moments of triumph, but in what remains after conflict has passed. I began to understand this as winter approached, bringing shorter days and a deeper quiet to the city. The windows framed a colder light now, sharper and more honest. I liked it. It demanded clarity.It. The hospital. My role expanded naturally. Students lingered after lectures, asking questions that went beyond exams and technique. They asked about boundaries, about authority, about how to recognize when confidence becomes cruelty. I answered them without rehearsed optimism. Medicine, I told them, is not a shield against moral failure. Intelligence does not equal virtue. Power must be examined constantly, or it will examine you instead. Some listened deeply. Some nodded politely and forgot. That was not my concern. Teaching, like surgery, requires release. You do your part, then you let the body decide how to heal. One afternoon, the dean invited me to lunch. He spoke of formalizing my position, of building an ethics module around lived experience rather than abstract theory. I agreed, not because I sought recognition, but because silence had already cost too much. If my years could spare even one student from becoming another Marcus, or another Sierra, it was worth the effort. Home, I made a habit of walking each evening. The route rarely changed, but my awareness did. I noticed which streets felt welcoming, which felt hurried. I learned the rhythms of the neighborhood again. Familiarity without fear is a quiet luxury. It was during one of these walks that I encountered a woman from my building, someone I had passed countless times without conversation. She slowed to walk beside me. I heard what happened, she said cautiously. Yes, I replied. I just wanted to say, she continued, thank you. For not pretending. The words surprised me more than any public acknowledgement had. They were not praised. They were relieved. You're welcome, I said, understanding what she meant. That night, I received a final notice from the court. Marcus's sentencing was complete. Years, not months. No appeals left that mattered. His name would linger in records, not in power. I read the notice once, then placed it in a drawer I labeled closed. Sierra called later that week. I'm thinking of moving, she said. Out of the city. That may be wise, I replied. Not to run, she added quickly. To start somewhere I'm not known. I considered that. Distance can be useful, I said, if it's paired with accountability. I know, she said. I'm still going to therapy. Good. She hesitated. I don't expect anything from you. That's a good place to begin, I said gently. We spoke a little longer, about mundane things, weather, work prospects, books she was reading. When the call ended, I did not feel drained. I felt cautiously hopeful, not for reconciliation, but for evolution. People can change. Not because they are forgiven, but because they are forced to see themselves clearly. As the year drew to a close, I hosted a small gathering. No ceremony. No speeches. Just people who had earned a place at my table. We ate well. We laughed. We spoke openly. The house held us easily, no longer echoing with restraint. When the last guest left and the dishes were done, I stood alone in the dining room and looked around. The table bore faint scratches now, signs of use rather than damage. I ran my fingers over them, feeling no urge to erase them. Perfection had never been the goal. Integrity was. I turned off the lights one by one, letting the darkness settle naturally, not as a threat but as rest. The clock ticked steadily, marking time that now belonged to me. I went to bed with the quiet certainty that whatever remained ahead would be faced on my terms. The final season arrived without ceremony. No dramatic shift announced it. No single event marked its beginning. Instead, it settled into my life the way wisdom often does. Quietly, after the noise has exhausted itself. I noticed it first in my body. The stiffness in my arm had faded into something manageable, a faint reminder rather than a limitation. My handwriting had steadied. My grip had returned. I no longer tested my movements before making them. I simply moved. The body, when treated with patience and respect, remembers what it was made to do. I noticed it next in my thoughts. I no longer rehearsed conversations that might happen. I no longer imagined defenses against threats that were gone. My mind, once constantly scanning for danger, had learned to rest. Silence had become neutral instead of ominous. Solitude felt chosen rather than imposed. The hospital, the ethics program took shape. It was small at first, a seminar, a discussion group, but it grew quickly. Students spoke openly in those rooms, more openly than I had expected. They confessed uncertainty, ambition, fear. They asked questions no textbook could answer. What happens when authority goes unchecked? How do you intervene when silence feels safer? Where does responsibility end? I never pretended to have perfect answers. I told them the truth instead, that the hardest decisions are rarely about knowledge, and almost always about courage. That harm does not begin with violence. It begins with permission. They listened. Some weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from one of those students. She wrote that she had reported misconduct during her residency, despite pressure not to. She wrote that she had remembered my words when her voice shook. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer as my husband's old correspondence. Legacy, I was learning, does not require monuments. Home. The house felt complete. Not flawless. Complete. There were evenings I spent alone with a book and tea, the lamp casting a soft circle of light on the page. There were mornings when friends joined me for breakfast, voices filling the rooms easily. There were days of sadness, still, when grief for my husband surfaced unexpectedly, or when I thought of the daughter I once knew and mourned the distance between us. Grief did not mean regret, it meant honesty. Sierra and I settled into a pattern that suited us both. We spoke occasionally. We did not revisit the past unless it served clarity. She moved to another city and found work that paid modestly but demanded accountability. She continued therapy. She no longer asked me to fix things. When she visited, she respected my boundaries without resentment. That mattered. One afternoon, during one of those visits, she stood in the kitchen watching me prepare lunch. "You look lighter," she said. "I am," I replied. She nodded slowly. "I'm trying to be." "I see that," I said, and meant it. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No tearful absolution. What grew between us was quieter and sturdier, mutual recognition. That was enough. The anniversary of my injury passed without fanfare. I noticed it only because the weather matched that night exactly. Cool, still, deceptively calm. I stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker on, one by one, like neurons firing in a living brain. For a moment, memory pressed close. Then it receded. I poured myself a glass of water, raised it in a small private gesture, and drank. I was not celebrating survival, I was acknowledging choice. Choice had saved me. Not the governor. Not the law. Not even my profession. Those were instruments. The incision had been mine to make. Later that evening, I sat at the dining table, the same table where hunger had once been used as a weapon, and ate a simple meal. Bread, soup, fruit. Enough. Always enough. The clock ticked steadily in the corner. Time no longer felt like something slipping away, it felt like something unfolding. I thought of the question people had asked me again and again in different forms. Was it too harsh? Was it necessary? Could you have forgiven more? The answer had not changed. Dignity is not cruelty. Boundaries are not punishment. Silence, when it protects harm, is violence. I had chosen life. Not just breath and heartbeat, but authorship. Ownership. Presence. When I turned off the light and prepared for sleep, I felt no unfinished business tugging at me. No debts left unpaid. No words clawing to be spoken. The house rested with me. And in that quiet, I understood something finally and completely. I was not defined by what had been done to me, I was defined by what I refused to allow ever again.